Every civilization in history has made the same promise. Your money is secure. Every ruler has sworn that their system will endure forever. But time has disproved them all. From ancient Rome to revolutionary France, from the Confederacy to present-day Lebanon, people have opened their eyes one morning to discover that the wealth they relied on had turned into paper and dust. Salaries lost their meaning, savings dissolved, and faith in strong systems vanished. Collapse is not a rare event. It's the natural rhythm of history. The real question isn't if financial systems fail, but what you'll do when they do. The biggest danger isn't volatility or inflation. It's the comforting illusion that what exists today will last forever. We stare at our bank balances, at the logo on our national currency, and convince ourselves these numbers are carved in stone. But money isn't stone, it's confidence. And confidence can disappear in a single night. That's what makes the study of economic history both cruel and invaluable. Each downfall leaves behind clues, warnings about what truly safeguards wealth, and what only looks stable until the wind changes. When you trace these stories, a pattern appears. The survivors of history's collapses weren't the most loyal believers. They were the first to question. Consider the Byzantine Empire, remembered as Rome's eastern heir, the one that somehow lasted 1,000 years after its western half crumbled. At the center of its financial power stood the gold solidus, a coin so consistent in purity and weight that traders from Europe to Asia accepted it without hesitation. For centuries, it served as the world's most trusted currency, a medieval version of the global dollar. You'd imagine the Byzantines, of all people, would have remembered what destroyed their Roman ancestors: the slow poisoning of the silver denarius, a coin that emperors diluted until it was little more than base metal coated in silver. But history rarely teaches those who think they're exceptional. Centuries later, the Byzantines began the same fatal experiment, this time in gold. They trimmed its purity, stretched it thinner, blended it with cheaper metals. At first, no one noticed. Then the trust cracked. The coin that had anchored Mediterranean trade for generations became another political illusion. Once faith in its gold content faltered, the empire's economy began to unravel. Trade declined, savings devalued, and stability, that precious illusion, evaporated. And yet, not everyone lost everything. Those who had quietly stored real gold or invested in land beyond the emperor's reach preserved their fortune. Everyone else, holding the empire's promises, watched their wealth vanish. That episode left behind one of history's most enduring lessons. No government can resist the urge to dilute its own money. And when they do, true value escapes, flowing into the few things that rulers can't print or fake. Not every economic collapse is caused by kings tampering with coins. Sometimes, disaster arrives uninvited, like a storm from nowhere. In the middle of the 14th century, Europe was struck by something far more devastating than war or corruption: the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, as much as half the continent's population vanished. Cities emptied, villages disappeared, and trade routes that once carried goods now carried silence. Yet the story of the plague isn't just about death. It's also about transformation. When half the labor force is gone, the survivors suddenly matter more. Work becomes precious. People who remained alive could demand higher wages, choose better living conditions, and reshape their futures in ways unimaginable before. Land and food, once scarce, became abundant compared to the number of hands left to tend them. Families who had even a small amount of liquid wealth, silver, goods, or simply the ability to work, found themselves in a position of power. Properties that once cost fortunes could now be purchased for a fraction of their former price. Entire towns stood half empty, farms unplowed, and opportunity waited for those still breathing. If this feels eerily familiar, it should. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a modern echo of that ancient pattern. Supply chains broke, governments flooded economies with printed money, and inequality widened as people with savings bought assets while others fell behind. In America, housing prices soared, stock markets rebounded, and those living paycheck to paycheck were left scrambling to pay rent. The rhyme of history is clear. Pandemics redistribute wealth. They always have. The survivors of the Black Death rose because scarcity made their labor valuable. The survivors of COVID prospered because they had liquidity to buy when others could not. It's a grim but timeless truth. Crises do not create fairness. They reward those with reserves and crush those without them. Pandemics showed how fast a shock can rewrite an economy. But the next great collapse of history, Renaissance Florence, revealed something even more unsettling. Institutions that seem unshakable can fall in an instant. In the 1340s, Florence was the financial heart of Europe. Its elegant streets were home to powerful banking dynasties like the Bardi and Peruzzi, families whose names carried the same weight then as Wall Street does now. They financed popes, princes, and kings, including Edward III of England, who borrowed massive sums to fund his wars against France. It was a gamble that seemed safe. After all, how could a king fail to repay? But Edward did. He defaulted on his loans, and a shock rippled through Florence like an earthquake. The great banks fell, one after another. Depositors lost everything. Trade ground to a halt. The richest city in Europe suddenly found itself gasping for air. Ordinary citizens, who had trusted the prestige of these mighty houses, discovered a brutal truth. Size does not equal safety. A grand reputation is no shield when the debts come due. The very institutions that promised stability became engines of ruin. It was perhaps the earliest proof of a lesson we keep forgetting. Too big to fail is a comforting myth, one that always ends the same way. Every century repeats the pattern, from the Florentine collapse to Lehman Brothers in 2008, to Lebanese banks freezing accounts in 2019. People learn too late that trust in institutions is only good until the moment confidence disappears. Survival, history shows again and again, belongs to those who see fragility before others do, not to those who assume that prestige means protection. Most people remember the American Civil War for its battlefields, its generals, and the end of slavery. But behind the cannon smoke and political speeches raged another, quieter war. One fought over money itself. Both the Union in the North and the Confederacy in the South faced a harsh truth. Wars of that scale demanded resources far beyond what taxes could provide. So both sides did what desperate governments always do. They started printing promises. In the North, the federal government issued greenbacks, paper notes backed not by gold, but by the word and faith of the United States. At first, the experiment seemed inspired, even patriotic, but the more notes that poured into circulation, the less each one could buy. Inflation crept in, and confidence began to erode. Down south, the situation was even more dire. The Confederate government, starved for supplies and unable to tax effectively, unleashed a flood of graybacks, its own paper currency. By the end of the war, prices had exploded thousands of %. A soldier's pay became worthless before he could spend it. Families needed baskets of bills just to buy bread. By 1865, Confederate money wasn't merely weak, it was extinct. The great financial experiment had burned itself out. And what survived that inferno? Not the paper, not the promises, only the things that couldn't be printed. Land, food, gold, and goods. Anything with real physical value. For ordinary Southerners, the collapse was catastrophic. Lifetimes of savings dissolved into nothing. But for those with tangible assets, or the foresight to hold real wealth, the chaos became opportunity. They bought land and property at fire sale prices, while others watched everything vanish. It's a story few Americans are ever taught, but it's one of the most important. The United States has already experienced a currency collapse. And when it happened, protection didn't come from the paper in your wallet. It came from holding what the system couldn't inflate away. France's revolution promised liberty, equality, and a new start, but it also unleashed one of the most destructive monetary disasters in European history. In the 1790s, as revolutionaries tore down the monarchy and confiscated church lands, they needed a way to fund their brand new republic. Their solution seemed elegant. Print assignats, paper money supposedly backed by the value of all that seized property. At first, the plan worked. The economy stabilized briefly, markets revived, and citizens believed they were holding notes tied to real assets. But as always, temptation crept in. The government couldn't resist issuing more. Each new batch diluted the last. Prices began to surge. Wages froze. And the once proud assignat started to rot from within. Before long, farmers refused to trade their food for paper. They demanded silver, goods, or anything real. The cities grew restless. Bread riots erupted again, and the revolution that had promised equality began consuming its own people. By the mid-1790s, the French paper currency was as worthless as the monarchy it replaced. The grand promises of a new economic order vanished in smoke. Who survived that chaos? Not the patriots clutching paper emblazoned with the symbols of liberty. It was those who held what could not be printed: food, gold, property, and skill. The blacksmith, the farmer, the merchant. They were the ones who could still trade when faith and money collapsed. The truth was harsh but eternal. No currency, however noble its design, can outlive the trust that sustains it. And once that trust breaks, your savings don't fade, they disappear. Jump forward 2 centuries, and history plays its cruel melody again, this time in modern Asia. In 1997, it began quietly, almost invisibly, with a speculative attack on the Thai baht. Thailand had borrowed heavily in US dollars, trusting that its fixed exchange rate would never fail. But when the peg finally snapped, everything unraveled. Debts that once seemed manageable became unbearable overnight. Investors panicked and fled. Currencies across Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, Malaysia, and South Korea, tumbled in a brutal chain reaction. Factories closed, millions lost their jobs, and the dream of unstoppable Asian growth shattered in months. Governments turned to the International Monetary Fund for rescue, only to be handed austerity plans that deepened the pain. What started as a currency wobble became a humanitarian crisis. And yet, the pattern was hauntingly familiar. Those who held assets in foreign currency, dollars, gold, offshore investments, managed to stay afloat. Those who trusted their local banks and domestic savings were destroyed. Entire nations learned the same brutal lesson. Debt in someone else's money is a noose. When your currency collapses, your debt doesn't shrink, it explodes. And the ones who lent you the rope are never the ones who hang. For everyday citizens, the suffering was immense. Mortgages doubled, prices soared, jobs vanished. And while middle-class families lost everything, global investors bought their country's assets for pennies on the dollar. It looked like a local meltdown, but it was really a global transfer of wealth. A reminder that when trust in money breaks, power always flows to those holding the harder, stronger currency. The rhythm of collapse had not changed since Byzantium, Florence, or France. Only the stage was new, and the script was the same. By now, the pattern should feel painfully familiar. From France's revolutions to America's Civil War to Asia's debt implosions, the melody of collapse always returns. And in Lebanon, between 2019 and 2021, the tune played louder than ever. Without warning, the country's banks did something unthinkable to most people in the developed world. They simply shut their doors. One morning, citizens woke up to find their accounts frozen. Withdrawals were capped. Transfers abroad were blocked. And the Lebanese pound, once a symbol of regional stability, began to die. Within 2 years, it had lost over 90% of its value. A lifetime of savings turned into pocket change. Doctors, teachers, engineers, people who had spent decades working, were suddenly destitute. Crowds formed outside the banks, pleading to withdraw their own money. But the answer was always the same. There's nothing left. The illusion of safety shattered overnight. And the cruel truth became clear. Your bank account isn't a vault. It's a loan you've given to a system that can refuse to repay you. Those who had quietly moved their savings abroad, bought land, stored gold, or kept physical cash survived with dignity. Those who trusted the institutions were trapped inside a financial cage with no exit. It wasn't just an economic collapse. It was a betrayal. The moment an entire middle class realized their security was built on sand. If that feels far away, it shouldn't. Because echoes of Lebanon have already rippled across the world. In 2008, Americans watched their homes seized and pensions shattered while the banks that caused it were rescued. In 2020, during the pandemic, governments printed trillions, inflating assets for the wealthy while wages stagnated. And in 2023, U.S. regional banks crumbled in days when depositors lost confidence, proving that too big to fail was always a bedtime story for adults. The lesson couldn't be clearer. Every system works, until the day it doesn't. And when that day comes, those who trusted most lose everything fastest. So how do you protect yourself when the whole structure begins to fall apart? History's answer isn't simple, but it is consistent. In Byzantium, survival meant gold because emperors couldn't fake it. After the Black Death, it meant liquidity to buy abandoned farms and homes when others couldn't. In Florence, it meant not believing in too big to fail. In the Confederacy, hard goods kept families alive when money became worthless. In revolutionary France, it was food and land that outlasted the paper assignats. In modern Asia, it meant staying out of debt pegged to someone else's currency. And in Lebanon, it was escaping the banks before the doors locked. The details differ. The principle does not. Collapse punishes blind faith and rewards those who prepare for fragility. The cruel joke of every era is that destruction doesn't announce itself. It whispers, it erodes, it disguises itself as stability. And by the time people realize what's happening, it's already too late to move. But here's the paradox that should make you sit up. Collapse isn't only an ending. it's also a beginning. For most, it means ruin. For a few, it becomes the opportunity of a lifetime. When the Black Death wiped out half of Europe, peasants who survived suddenly found themselves in a world with too much land and not enough workers. They bought farms for pennies and rose into a new middle class. After the 2008 crash, people with cash bought homes and stocks at fire sale prices, while millions lost theirs. The pattern never changes. Crisis transfers wealth from the unprepared to the prepared. That's why protection isn't just defense. It's also positioning, being ready to act when others freeze. But here's the deeper truth. Wealth isn't only what you own. It's what you can do. The survivors of history weren't just people with gold or land. They were the ones who could create value when everything else stopped working. The baker who could still feed a town. The craftsman who could repair what others couldn't. The farmer who could grow food when markets failed. The merchant who could move goods across collapsing borders. These were the ones who didn't just endure, they rose. Because when money loses meaning, production doesn't. People still need to eat, build, trade, and live. And those who can meet real needs are never poor for long. That's the real protection. Not government promises, not paper wealth, not faith in institutions, but a combination of tangible assets, adaptable skills, and the awareness that illusions always end. Every collapse is a transfer, from the many who believed to the few who questioned, from paper to substance, from passive savers to active builders. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes loudly enough to hear. And if you ignore it, it doesn't forgive. So the real question isn't if things fall apart. They always do. The question is, when they do, will you be left holding promises or holding something real?